Hello. So in this video, we're going to do something a little bit different because I'm going to be talking about one point made by Hannah Arendt in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and connecting that to something that's currently going on in the United States at time of filming. So, brief overview of The Origins of Totalitarianism. This is a book that came out of Arendt's direct experience, having lived through the mid-20th century with the most prominent totalitarian regimes in world history, Nazi Germany and the Stalinist Soviet Union. What Arendt is attempting to do in this quite hefty book is to figure out how you get to totalitarianism out of the conditions that existed in 19th century and before Europe. So how do the particular trends, the particular values, worldviews, etc., of 19th century Europe lead up to totalitarianism? And in order to do this, she actually takes a long historical view going way, way back, at least to the medieval period, when you started to see coalescing of proto-nation states. Because one of the things that Arendt talks about is that totalitarianism depends on a form of ultra-nationalism that sees the in-group as the dominant or most historically, culturally, genetically significant and worthy group in world history. For the Nazis, this was the Aryan German. For the Soviet Union, this was the revolutionary proletariat. And the idea was that this was the most worthy group, and all other groups were, at the very least, lesser groups, if not actively worthy of destruction. So this is one element of this. And Arendt roots this in the long history of European anti-Semitism. She roots this in the long history of European colonialism, both of which build on what we would now call a kind of ethno-nationalism, right? The idea that my ethnic or religious or identity group is superior and that other ethnic or religious or identity groups are inferior, are in some way disposable, if that's what's required for the needs of my particular group. That's a very, very, very cursory overview of Arendt's key thesis. But one of the things that she argues that distinguishes totalitarianism from dictatorship or monarchy is that totalitarian regimes are largely arbitrary in their targeting of enemies. Now, the enemy is a crucial figure to the totalitarian. The enemy is absolutely necessary. There must be an enemy for totalitarianism to work. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart. It doesn't make any sense. Now, that enemy can be external, but often the enemy is both external and internal. This is part of the reason why the Jews have so often been targeted, why we have been so central to totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, is because we are simultaneously internal and external, right? This has always been, this was one of the big things this was prominent with like the Dreyfus affair in France, right? The idea that, the Jews are an internal minority. They are a domestic minority. We are a domestic minority. Jewish Americans, for instance, like me. But but also that we have this external loyalty to international Judaism or whatever it is. Nowadays, it would be more likely to be identified as the State of Israel. So this idea that we can never truly be loyal to our country because we have divided loyalties with a larger international group. For ultra-nationalists like totalitarians, that is very fertile ground for building an enemy who's simultaneously internal and external. And it doesn't actually matter, for instance, that Dreyfus was innocent. It doesn't actually matter that the overwhelming majority of the people who died in the Holocaust had nothing to do with any of the particular concrete concerns of Depression-era Germany. But that's the thing, is the notion of the enemy is central to totalitarianism. And I said before that the enemy is arbitrary, and I think this is a really important point that Arendt makes. So I want to read you this passage. It's a bit lengthy, it's a bit complicated because Arendt's writing style as a philosopher is not always super, super easy, but we're going to go through it. We're going to talk about this. And we'll sort of figure out what's going on. And then we're going to talk about the parallel with what's going on in the contemporary US. So, it says here, only in the initial stages, when a struggle for power is still going on, are its victims, that is the victims of the totalitarian regime, those who can be suspected of opposition. It then embarks upon its totalitarian career with the persecution of the objective enemy, which may be the Jews or the Poles, as in the case of the Nazis, or so-called counter-revolutionaries. I'm going to do scare quotes around the actual things that she puts quotes around, so you can tell. An accusation which, in Soviet Russia, is established before any question as to the behavior of the accused has arisen at all, who may be people who at one time owned a shop or a house or had parents or grandparents who owned such things, or who happened to belong to one of the Red Army occupational forces, or were Russians of Polish origin. Only in its last and fully totalitarian stage are the concepts of the objective enemy and the logically possible crime abandoned. The victims chosen completely at random and even without being accused declared unfit to live. This new category of undesirables may consist, as in the case of the Nazis, of the mentally ill or persons with lung and heart disease, or in the Soviet Union of people who happened to have taken up in that percentage, varying from one province to another, which is ordered to be deported. The consistent arbitrariness negates human freedom more efficiently than any tyranny ever could. One had at least to be an enemy of tyranny in order to be punished by it. Freedom of opinion was not abolished for those who were brave enough to risk their necks. Theoretically, the choice of opposition remains in totalitarian regimes too, but such freedom is almost invalidated if committing a voluntary act only assures a punishment that everyone else may have to bear anyway. Freedom in this system has not only dwindled down to its last and apparently still indestructible guarantee, the possibility of suicide, but has lost its distinctive mark because the consequences of its exercise are shared with completely innocent people. So, what the heck does Arendt mean by this? Basically, what this means is that the totalitarian regime, to a certain extent, has objective enemies. That is, enemies who are sort of recognizable as an out-group, in contrast to the in-group, whether that's Aryan Germans in the case of Hitler's Germany, or revolutionary proletarians in the case of the Soviet Union. The out-group, to a certain extent, continues to function as an enemy, but the totalitarian regime doesn't actually require that. It doesn't require that someone be a Jew, be bourgeois, be Roma, whatever it is, in order to be persecuted. This is precisely the shift from what he or she calls tyranny to totalitarianism, right? Under tyranny, if you do something against the regime, you are penalized for it. If you speak out against the dictator, you speak out against the leader, whatever it is, you can be penalized for it. And generally you are. And that happens under totalitarianism as well. So that aspect doesn't disappear. But what totalitarianism does that tyranny does not is totalitarianism targets at random. That is, anyone can become a victim of the totalitarian regime, regardless of whether or not they have done anything to merit that penalty. If you were in Soviet Russia, for instance, the Soviet Union, if you were in Nazi Germany, you could at any time be accused and executed. Whether you had ever actually been disloyal, whether you had ever actually questioned Hitler or Stalin or whatever it is, it did not matter. There was no real question of, have you done something wrong? Have you been disloyal? And this is where what Arendt is talking about at the end there, when she's talking about how freedom as such disappears. If the freedom to resist and pay with your life is in the freedom to, she argues that the freedom to resist and pay with your life is invalidated if people who do not resist may similarly pay with their life. They may face the same penalty without having committed the crime. Then the crime itself becomes pointless. The crime itself is no longer an act of resistance. It no longer strikes at the regime if the regime does not care about why it is penalizing people. So this is a point that Arendt makes, and I think it's a really, really, really important one. No matter who you were, no matter how loyal you were to the party or to the state, you could be subject to execution. And of course, this is historically founded. The SA, the stormtroopers, the brown shirts, which were the original Nazi fighters, kind of the equivalent of groups like the Proud Boys today, basically street thugs who went out and fought for the cause against perceived enemies. The SA was liquidated. They were loyal to Hitler. They were loyal to the Nazi Party. But as soon as they were no longer politically beneficial to Hitler, he had them killed. The leader of the SA was executed, I believe, in his apartment. And many of the top-ranking officials of the SA were killed, and the organization was disbanded. Similarly, after Stalin took over in the Soviet Union, he had purged is the term people typically use. Basically, he had executed a lot of members of the original revolutionary movement who had served in the Russian Revolution and in the Civil War. Not because they had ever actually done anything wrong, but because he turned the sights of power on them. So this is historically grounded. The idea that loyalty cannot save you. Being a good soldier, being on the side of the party cannot save you in a totalitarian regime. Now, how does this connect to the US today? Well, there's a couple of very interesting things that have been going on of late on the American political right. Boycotts and social media troll storms, things like this, critiques run through social media. First, of Anheuser-Busch, because of Bud Light. Dylan Mulvaney is a trans influencer. I don't know that much about Dylan Mulvaney. I don't know that much about her career. I didn't really follow the Bud Light story too much because I don't really care. I don't drink Bud Light. But Bud Light released a can with Dylan Mulvaney on it. I think she won some kind of contest or something like that. I don't really know. Long story short, many, many, many people in right-wing media, social media, and the sort of day-to-day right-wingers turned drastically against Anheuser-Busch. They released videos of themselves destroying or shooting or throwing out Bud Light, switching to Coors, whatever it is. And then more recently, Chick-Fil-A has come under attack for being woke because they have a DEI policy, diversity, equity, and inclusion. No, that's not at all unusual. I believe Chick-fil-A has had their DEI policy for quite a number of years now. Almost every company today has one. It's a standard thing that companies do because it can lead to legal problems if you don't have a DEI program. So, Chick-fil-A has now incurred the wrath of right-wing social media, right-wing media, etc., for their DEI statement. They've been accused of going woke. Now, with Anheuser-Busch, this boycott actually did cost them a lot of money. Their stock prices dipped, their profit margins dipped. I don't know what's going to happen or has happened with Chick-fil-A. I'm not really going to follow that storyline, but the reason that this is interesting and the reason that this aligns with the arbitrary use of power that Arendt is talking about in The Origins of Totalitarianism is because these are both very, very conservative companies. Anheuser-Busch donates massive amounts of money to Republican politicians. Massive campaign contributions to right-wing politicians, which incidentally is part of the reason why many right-wing politicians kind of were like, hey, everybody, let's not go too crazy with the anti-Bud Light stuff. How about you just, keep buying it, keep their stock prices up so I can get that fat campaign donation. That didn't actually work out that well because many people still boycotted Anheuser-Busch. Again, profits took a huge hit. Chick-fil-A, extremely, extremely conservative. They have, in the past, incurred the wrath of left-leaning and liberal people because they've donated a lot of money to supporters of conversion therapy, anti-LGBT politicians, etc., etc. They're a very, very Christian company. There's no real doubt about their Christian credentials, their Christian fundamentalism. So, this is where we get into the totalitarian aspect of what's going on right now. The reality is that these two companies have, generally speaking, been good right-wing supporters. They've been supporters of the kinds of positions held by the people now boycotting their products and critiquing them online. But that has not saved them from the repercussions of this really quite arbitrary culture wars nonsense. This idea that because Chick-fil-A has a DEI statement, which again is very standard and virtually every company today has one, but the idea that because they have that somehow makes them a woke company, an anti-right-wing company, it's kind of insane. But it becomes less insane and becomes more logical if you think about it in the context of the origins of totalitarianism. The wrath of the totalitarian regime, or in this case, a sort of weird totalitarian media / social media echo chamber, the wrath of that can be turned against anyone at any time, whether or not there is a real reason. And that's what the right wing promises for the US.